After completing my 10th class exams in 1979, my father suggested that I go and help my father's uncle and learns astrology. Mathematics being my favorite subject, I learned the calculations. My grandfather taught me how to calculate the inclinations of each planet and how to calculate the lagna and the meridian center MC, and he gave me some birth charts to draw. Thus, I learned how to draw the birth charts first and showed interest in predictions. So, my grandfather told me some predictions, some of the tips that he usually uses for predictions. And after learning those tips, I documented some of them. I verified with my father. While my father and my grandfather have laid the foundation for me to get interested in astrology, for almost a decade or 2 decades, I didn't show any interest. Welcome to Shastrikara's Astrological series. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about a native and the reason why when these type of astrological charts are seen, I highly recommend that that particular native better remain unmarried rather than getting married. We all know the old English old saying that marriages are made in heaven. So that means that there is always a possibility for some people not to get married, and because their destiny is defined as to remain unmarried or single. When a native tries to go against the destiny and gets married, the planetary combinations will try its level best so that the native gets separated and finally end up being single for the remaining part of his or her life. In this example, in this presentation, I took an example of a male native and I'm going to explain to you why the destiny, which is to remain unmarried or remain single, what happened when the native went against the destiny that was defined for him. This is the chart of that male native that I am going to take as an example to show that when the destiny is defined for a person to remain unmarried, and if we go against that, how the planetary combinations will force the native to behave in such a way that whatever the native's destiny is being fulfilled. Here in this presentation, I'm going to take the example of this male native who was born on 28th March 1976 at 5:04 a.m. in India. And here I'm going to take in as much detail as possible, try to explain to you from an astrological perspective why the destiny was defined for this particular native to remain unmarried or be remain spend his life as a single rather than being a family man. Now let me start analyzing this particular birth chart with the assumption that I have no idea whether the native was married or unmarried. Just as soon as I get the chart, the first and the foremost thing that by default I look is the Lagnadipati. Here the ascendant is Aquarius, so the Lagnadipati is Saturn. And in the ascendant, I see in the first house, I see Moon and Venus. So what it tells you is that the ascendant and from Moon and the ascendant, the seventh house lord is same. So this clearly tells you that the destiny and the mind should go match is should go together, and the seventh house is the one that has a direct aspect for them. And then comes a Venus. Venus is the natural seventh house lord, and Venus has co-joined is in being in the first house. It is also looking at the seventh house, so the natural seventh house lord is also looking at the seventh house. So now we have the moon looking at the seventh house. The ascendant, the first house is as by default having a direct aspect on the seventh house, and the natural seventh house Lord Venus is also looking at the seventh house. So the seventh house becomes the primary uh, decision maker for this particular NATO. We don't know what exactly is that at this point. And then let's start looking at the other houses. In the second house, we have Sun and Mercury. Those two are very Sun. Even the Sun is defined as a malefic planet. Sometimes uh, it is Mercury is the eighth house lord, so it is the functional malefic, and so the functional malefic Mercury is residing in the second house Kutumbasthanamu, co-joined with the Sun, who is the seventh house lord. And by the way, I forgot it. Moon is the sixth house lord. So the house of separations lord is Moon, is residing in the first house, and Moon also controls the mind. So when the house of separations lords is Moon, naturally the native's intention will always be um, that's one of the reason why the destiny is defined as for this particular native to remain unmarried is because the house of separations lord Moon is Moon, which is the native's mind, and is also in the first house, having a direct aspect on the seventh house. Just by looking at this, it can at a higher altitude you can say that the natives is not fit to to get married and have a family life. To add it, in the second house you got Sun, the seventh house lord. Sun, who is also sometimes treated as a malefic, is residing in the second house, that is the Kutumbasthanamu, and Sun is co-joined with Mercury. Mercury is the eighth house lord, the functional malefic. So the second house is now having the seventh house lord and a functional malefic. So the second house got spoiled too. So now the first house got a little bit uncomfortable because Moon, the sixth house lord Moon, is residing there, and the second house got spoiled because the functional malefic eighth house lord and the seventh house lord are co-joined in the second house itself. Then let's go to see who is in the third house. In the third house you have Jupiter. Jupiter is the lord of the 11th and second houses. So 11th house is house of desires and second house is Kutumbasthanamu, or ability to start a family. And that particular house's lord is Jupiter, is residing in third house. Until that point it is fine, but Jupiter co-joined with Ketu, that indicates that Jupiter is having a direct aspect on Rahu, and Rahu is another malefic planet, and it always creates chaos. And since it is creating a chaos in the third house where the second and 11th house lord is residing, naturally the lord also gets impacted by that chaos. The fourth house lord is Venus, who is in the first house, and fourth house is empty. The fifth and eighth house lord is Mercury, and Mercury is in the second house, and the third and the 10th house lord Mars is residing there. That's fine. Then comes the important is the sixth house. In sixth house lord is Moon. Moon is residing in the first house, and the first and the 12th house lord Saturn is residing in the sixth house. That means there is a Parivartana yoga between the first house lord and the sixth house lord. That's a very important thing we have to see here. The seventh house lord is Sun. Sun is residing in the second house, and seventh is empty. Eighth house lord is Mercury. Eighth is also empty. And the ninth house lord is Venus. Venus is residing in the first house, and Rahu is in the ninth house, the Dharmasthanamu. In Dharmasthanamu, Rahu is residing, and then the 10th, 11th, and 12th, all these houses are empty. So when you look at the chart, you can clearly say that these houses, the important houses that pertain for a person to get married, is all chaotic. After done looking at the house lots and the houses where they are residing, the next step that I do is to look at the aspects. Here I'm going to take the aspects of three slow important planets: Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. And now when you look at Jupiter is the second house lord and 11th house lord. So when you look at the 11 Jupiter's aspect, what you see is that Jupiter's fifth aspect is on the seventh house, Remember, see, Jupiter is looking at the seventh house, and the seventh house Lord Sun is residing in the second house owned by Jupiter. So Jupiter has been became a malefic because it is having it is being aspected by Rahu, and this malefic Jupiter, functional malefic Jupiter, is now looking at the seventh house, which is the house owned by Sun, and Sun is also a malefic, and that Sun is residing in the house owned by Jupiter and co-joined with the eighth house Lord Mercury. So this relationship itself is another thing to indicate that the native is not suitable. It's for this native it is not suitable to get married. The next is direct aspect. Jupiter's direct aspect is on ninth house where Rahu is residing, and then Jupiter's ninth aspect is on the 11th house, that is its own house. Fortunately, 11th house is empty. And next comes Mars. Mars, the reason why I picked up Mars is because Mars is also looking at some of the important houses that have a direct indirect relationship when it comes to marriage. Mars fourth aspect is on the eighth house. Mars is residing in the fifth house and looking at the eighth house. That's not a good sign. And Mars direct aspect is on the 11th house. This is why I said I'm looked at Mars. 11th house deals with house of desires. So Mars is now looking at the 11th house, the house of desires. And Mars 8th aspect is on the 12th house, which is the pleasures of bed. So a violent planet is looking at the house of desires and the pleasures of bed house. So that tells you that the native's intention when it comes to these two bhavas are very violent. The third one is Saturn. Since Saturn is the first and the 12th house lord, and residing in the sixth house, the house of separations, let me look at Saturn. First and the foremost, Saturn is having a Parivartana yoga with Moon. Moon is the sixth house lord and Saturn is the first house lord, and there's a Parivartana yoga between those two. Then Saturn's third aspect is again on the 8th house. Remember, Mars fourth aspect is on the 8th house. Saturn's third aspect is on 8th house. Sun and Mercury's direct aspect is on the 8th house. The 8th house is secret affairs or secret dealings, and sometimes 8th house, so it is not a good sign there. Then Saturn's direct aspect residing in the 6th house, its direct aspect is on the 12th house, which is the pleasures of bed, its own house, which is not a good sign. And Saturn's 10th aspect is on the 3rd house, where the 2nd and the 11th house Lord Jupiter is residing. Already Jupiter became functional malefic with the direct aspect from Rahu. Now it is also having a 10th aspect from another malefic planet, Saturn. So overall, the 2nd and the 4th 11th house Lord Jupiter became a functional malefic. In the 2nd house, a functional malefic 8th house Lord, the functional malefic 8th house Lord Mercury is residing. In the 2nd house, the 7th house Lord is residing, but 7th house Lord is Sun, who is also a malefic. So this combination tells you that the native's marital life will not be happy, and the destiny for this native has been defined to remain unmarried because of all these reasons. And when I looked at the Bihurugala Sarala Paddhati rule, Saturn is residing in the 6th house, so it shouts that it owns the 6th house. It knows that Moon is residing in the house owned by Saturn. That is the reason why now, apart from 1st and 12th houses, Saturn will also rule the 6th house. So the decision maker when it comes to the 12th house, the pleasures of bed, or the house for separation, or the Tanusthanamu, all the three is done by Saturn. Another Bihurugu Sarla Paddhati rule says that wherever Saturn resides, he spoils the bhava of the next house. He is residing in the 6th house. The next house is the 7th house. So by default, he has to spoil the bhava of the 7th house. And the lord of the 7th house is Sun, Saturn's bitter enemy. So when he spoils the bhava of the 7th house, the spoilage will be to the maximum extent possible, because the house is owned by his bitter enemy. So the second house, how you can see how bad it is. The 6th and the 1st house lords having a Parivartana yoga, and the 6th house being controlled by a malefic planet, The 12th house is controlled by malefic planet. You can say what's the outcome. These two are major houses when we are talking about marital life. And Mars, a violent planet, is looking at the 11th and 12th houses, so another drawback here. And above all, Saturn is spoiling the 7th house because it is owned by its bitter enemy. So based upon all these combinations, it is clearly visible that the destiny for this particular native is to remain unmarried. Now that I had gone through the house lords, let me go through and look at the first of all I do is what I check is the Bihuruga Chakra Paddhati, so that I can get from a high level altitude uh, what is the role for the cycle rulers when it comes to for the ability for a native to get married. Here Venus, by default Venus is the planet according to Bihuruga Chakra Paddhati for any native to get married. So here let's start with Venus. Venus is co-joined with the 6th house lord residing in the first house, and Venus is the lord of the 4th and 9th houses. So basically we can say that hey, Venus, since it is the lord of the 9th house, the Dharmasthanamo, the native will follow the dharma when it comes to the ability to get married or getting married. And now but Venus has co-joined with the 6th house lord moon, and so something might have some minor hurdles. So even so, if accidentally the native gets married, since it has co-joined with the 6th house lord, there is always a possibility for the native to get separated. Remember the destiny based upon the house lord houses, lords, house lords, and the aspects, it has been clearly visible that the destiny for this native is to remain unmarried. But since the Venus is the natural 7th house lord and residing in the 9th house lord, Dharmasthanadipati, and it's residing in the first house having a direct aspect on the 7th house, Venus during its cycle rule according to Bihuruga Chakra Paddhati, that means starting around age of 25 and ending by the age of 36, those 12 years. For 12, those 12 years, if Venus does make gives that ability for a native to get married, their marriage will not remain because it has co-joined with the 6th house lord moon. So let's go and look at what else is possible for this particular native. The sun is a 7th house lord residing in the 2nd house. So after the 37th birthday and before the 30th birthday is another possibility for the native to get married. And again the next possibility is after 42nd birthday and before 43rd birthday, the native will have the ability to get married because sun is the 7th house lord, and sun will be activating the 2nd house and the 7th house uh, accordingly. That means at the age of 37 and the age of 32. Because of that reason, like Venus, the sun will also give the ability for the native to get married, but the marriage will not last for a long time because of other reasons. Using the Bihru Chakra Paddhati, we came to a conclusion that Venus and Sun, they both will give the native an ability to get married, even though we know that the marriage will not last for a long time. Now let me go to the Vimsottari Dasa and see during the peak marriage age, that means somewhere at the age of 25 or 26, which is at the age of 25 it will be 2000, from year 2000 is when the native will be 24 years old. Okay, so the peak marriage period from 2000, I will add 24 plus 12 is 36. So from 2000 to 2013. So let me go and see what is the Vimsottari Dasa during that period. If you look here, the Vimsottari Dasa is Saturn Mahadasa. Saturn is the Lagnadipati. So the Lagnadipati residing in the 6th house, Mahadasa is running, and I had clearly explained how Saturn spoils the 7th house, how Saturn is 10th aspect is on the 2nd and 11th house lord Jupiter, and Saturn's direct aspect is on its own house, 12th house. So basically Saturn will not let the marriage happen, even though according to Bihuru Chakra Paddhati, Venus and Sun might try its level best to for the native to get married, since Saturn is also controlling the sixth house apart from first and 12th houses. Sixth house is house of separations, so it will make sure that even if the native gets married, the native does not stay for a longer time, the marriage does not stay for a longer time, and they get separated at the earliest possible. The Vimsotari Dasa had clearly shown us that Saturn Mahadasa is running and it is not going to let the marriage happen, and if the native gets accidentally gets married because of the sixth house residing in the sixth house, Saturn will make sure that the marriage gets will be broken, and they will get the native gets separated from his or her spouse. In here it is the his spouse. Okay, now just to make sure that is there any other dasa system that is supporting the native to get married and have a happy married life. I looked at the other one called the Yogini Dasa, and if you look at the Yogini Dasa starting 2000 all the way till 2019, the Yogini Dasa, the periods are Rahu, Moon, Sun, and Jupiter. You know, Rahu is in the ninth house, looking at the second house lord, so it creates a second house. In the second house, it creates a dynamic. The second house will be dynamic. That means the Kutumba Sthanama will be completely chaotic because of Rahu. So if the native gets married, that during that period it will be chaotic, and that might result into separation. The next is the moon. Moon has the Parivartana Yoga with the first house lord Saturn, and moon is residing in the house owned by Saturn, so moon can't do anything. Even it's a sixth house lord residing in the first house. Moon always tends, means the native will always have the mentally the native will always be thinking of figuring out a way to get separated from his spouse, means apply for divorce or become a or something like that. Next comes Sun, 2008 to 2010. During that time, Sun, even though Sun is the seventh house lord, since it is co-joined with the eighth house functional malefic Mercury residing in the second house, even if the native gets married, the second, because of the second house and the eighth house lord residing, the ability to start, there will not be any ability for the native to start the family. The next comes the Jupiter, the last one. The Jupiter is the second and 11th house lord residing in the third house, getting a direct aspect from Rahu and the 10th aspect of Saturn. So this Jupiter period 2010 to 2013 is also not possible for the native to have a stable marital life. The last one is Mars. Mars is a most violent planet here. Its fourth aspect is on the 8th house, which is not a good sign. Direct aspect is on the 11th house, which is the house of desires, and the 8th aspect is on the 12th house, which is pleasures of bed. So a violent planet looking at the pleasures of bed or having looking at the house of desires is not a positive sign. So this might result in some sort of a chaos in the native's marital life if the native was still married and remained married by 2013, and that might lead into separation. Just like I said earlier, the moon will be tempting the native mentally to get separated. Now comes the question, what exactly happened to this native in his life? Means, what did the native ever got married? If so, how long was the marital life lasted? And what is the current situation for this particular native? Let me explain you what exactly happened. I will tell you what exactly happened first and then explain you from the astrological perspective. So, what exactly happened on that day? Let I did ask the native to send me and email me about the information what exactly happened on that day, means in his life when it comes to marriage. And according to the native, he first got married in 2009, and within a year he got divorced. Again, in 2014 he got married again, and again the same thing, within a year he got divorced. And the native, when I asked for the reason why it happened twice, the same event has happened twice, then his response was that the thought process or mind compatibility was not there between him and the girl that he got married. So this is the actually what happened. Now, I had already explained you in detail about how the moon, the sixth house lord moon, being the sixth house lord moon is our mind, is in the first house and residing in the house owned by Saturn, and Saturn is residing in the house owned by moon, and there's a parivartana yoga there. And Saturn, the first and the 12th house lords residing in the sixth house, is shouting that it owns the sixth house too, and spoils the seventh house. So this is the what I explained before, and now this is exactly what happened. Let me conclude it based upon what the information I got from this particular native. Let me, from the astrological perspective, reiterate the reason for this particular native to have this type of issue. And when you look at the chart, first of all, when the native got married, both the times it's a Saturn Mahadasa running, and Saturn is residing in the sixth house, yelling, shouting that he owns the sixth house. Sixth house deals with house of separations. So Saturn is now yelling and saying that he owns the house of separations. At the same time, Saturn also owns the first house, that is the Tanusthanama or self, and Saturn is also owning the 12th house, which is the pleasures of bed. Now residing in the sixth house, he spoiled the seventh house. The owner of the house, the seventh house, is Sun, who is Saturn's bitter enemy. So he thoroughly spoiled the seventh house from an astrological perspective, and he is the one who initiated the getting separated, and the first and the other reasons might be either some sort of a incompatibility between the native and the girl and the spouse and his spouse, for a variety of reasons. So this is exactly what is going to happen. This is the destiny has been cleared. From astrological perspective, the destiny has been clearly defined for this particular native to remain unmarried. The native tried to marry, got married twice, and both the times, because it is against the destiny, uh, the marriage got broken, and now he's back as a unmarried, as a single person here in his life. So whatever the destiny is, that's what he is going to end up with.